Dementia Understand Together is a national campaign led by the HSE, supported by many partners, which aims to raise awareness of dementia and encourage us all to create communities which are inclusive of people with dementia as well as their families. Healthy Ireland at Your Library collaborates closely with this campaign, and in today's episode I'm talking with Dr. Sean O'Dowd, consultant neurologist and clinical lead at the National Dementia Services, about how extraordinary the brain is and how best to maintain optimal brain health. So Sean, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Claire.
I feel like the brain as an organ is quite underestimated. It's responsible for so much, and yet I don't think it's as understood as it could be. Can you enlighten us a little bit about the workings of the brain?
I can try. I agree. I think the brain, it really defines us, doesn't it? It's probably the most complex organ in the body. And I guess unlike maybe the heart or the liver or the kidneys, we don't even fully really understand yet some of the functions of the brain or how it's interconnected. But I guess broadly speaking, we kind of think of the brain as divided into different lobes or sections, and they each have a different role in, how we function and perform and how we sort of behave, I suppose. So the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that's involved in our attention span and our maintaining concentration, multitasking, and kind of judgment and sort of those sort of functions. And then the temporal lobe is very important for memory. That's the part where we store memory and can access that to retrieve information when we need it. The parietal lobe is the part that's very kind of important for taking in information about the environment, sensory information particularly, and judging things like space and distance and planning what we do and how we move. And then at the back is the occipital lobe, which is important for the visual environment, and a lot of information from our eyes go through to there and how we see and perceive the world visually. And they're all integrated and have loads of cross connections. It's very sort of intricate. And like that, a lot of it we still are probably trying to understand. But they're sort of the main kind of the kind of workhouse parts of the brain. And then a little bit deeper in the brain, we have movement centers that are, where information is stored about how to walk, how to maintain our balance. And parts of what's lower down, then it's called the brain stem, where information goes down to the rest of the kind of the face, the neck, the arms, the legs. So it's a really intricate network, more intricate and complex than the most modern, fanciest computer. But I guess what we know is that like things like how we nourish and maintain its health are really important for keeping our brains fit and healthy as we get through into middle life and later life, and preventing brain diseases associated with aging, like dementia, for example.
And as well as helping us to function day to day, is it also responsible for how we feel, for our emotions, how we react to situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there are very complex interplays between different parts of the brain, which are sort of responsible for how we react to things, how we control our emotions, or how we express our emotions. And of course, our well-being and our mental health is all, sort of generated from the brain.
And when we talk about brain health, what does that mean?
So it's a good question, because it's a term that is used quite a lot nowadays, and there isn't, I suppose, any one black or white definition for what it means. But broadly speaking, I guess it's the concept of nurturing and nourishing our brain to keep it healthy, to keep our function maintained. So to try to prevent things that, might affect our reserve, our ability to maintain our cognitive function. And cognition is kind of, again, a term that describes lots of things, including memory, judgment, planning, that all of those kind of higher order functions of our brain. So brain health is sort of a concept of trying to reduce risk to those things being compromised. And there are lots of different things that we can do in day-to-day life to maintain our brain health. I suppose a lot of information is out there in recent decades about maintaining heart health or lung health, and brain health has lagged behind a little bit, but now we have a lot of scientific evidence about things that we can do to preserve the health of our brain. And that's really important, particularly as we get older, because as we get older we are more susceptible to brain diseases.
And as you said, as we age, we expect there to be a certain decline in the brain, but is there anything we can do to slow that decline, or is it inevitable?
Yeah, so I suppose, normal age, this has been fairly well studied, and normal aging is associated with some change in cognitive function, but not usually anything significant in terms of impacting day-to-day life. But the sort of parts of the brain that are involved in speed at which the brain processes information, or what's called working memory, as part of normal aging, that does decrease a little bit. So the common thing about a little bit slower to find a word, a little bit slower to put a name to a face, going into a room and having to pause or retrace your step for a second. What was it I came in here for? Those kind of symptoms are something which we can see as part of life at any age, but a little bit more common with normal aging. But I suppose it's when those kind of symptoms or other symptoms around making memories and being able to recall memories, transition from being just a simple nuisance thing that happens now and again to a problem that's impacting on day-to-day life. That's sort of a more significant situation where, can lead to the emergence of more difficulty. So from the perspective of trying to maintain brain health, there are lots of different, interventions and things that we can do, particularly in, from our kind of 40s on, to try to reduce the risk of significant cognitive problems or dementia developing.
So what are some of the specific things we can do to slow that decline and keep our brain healthy?
So I guess there's been a lot of studies looking into this over the last few years, and a lot of very robust and kind of reliable data looking at big populations of people who, over time as people have aged, and comparing at those who've sort of aged well from a brain health perspective versus those who might have developed cognitive impairment or dementia. And from that, there's been, particularly the WHO and the Lancet have identified a significant number of things which are largely to do with kind of lifestyle that we can change or modify, which are very likely to reduce, to at least defer, if not entirely eliminate, the risk of developing dementia. So for example, things like not smoking, moderate amounts of alcohol, taking regular exercise, and I suppose staying socially connected. This is something that's particularly important in later life, and probably the lived experience of lots of people over the last few years with the COVID pandemic is a kind of testimony to that, the importance of social connection from a general health point of view. And that's certainly true from a brain health perspective also. And I guess there are a couple of other things that are more specific and sometimes come as a surprise to people. For example, hearing loss. So hearing loss in middle life, that's sort of defined as maybe from about 45 to 65, is very strongly associated with a higher risk of developing cognitive impairment and dementia as people get older. And what's interesting is that if that's addressed by the use of hearing aids, that risk is mitigated, or it's gotten rid of, so to speak. So that's something which a lot of people wouldn't necessarily be familiar with, but it's been clearly identified as a risk factor. So it's really important that if people have concerns for themselves about their hearing or that of a loved one, to have that assessed. And I guess other kind of aspects that need to be, thought of would be things like general what we'd say is, kind of heart health and cardiovascular health, because the link between the heart and the brain is very significant. So keeping an eye on blood pressure, keeping an eye on weight. I suppose in modern life, there's a tendency to eat less maybe balanced diets, and as a consequence of that, the population is becoming more overweight, and obesity like that, particularly in middle life, has been associated as a risk factor for dementia. So maintaining a stable, healthy weight is another sort of key thing that we can do to try to keep our brain healthy.
And can we delve a little bit deeper into the social connection piece?
Sure.
Because I think when people think social life, they sort of think the pub and the nightclub, but we're talking about staying connected with people and growing our social circle and continuing to learn. So it's a bit more outside the norm of a Friday or Saturday night. Yeah,
exactly. So I suppose it's about, sort of connectedness, and there's a lot of data from studies showing that people who have been inclined to not be as involved with, and it can be as simple as family and close friend networks, but also there's a lot of information suggesting that getting into, as you said, learning new things, getting involved in social activity and recreational sort of groups, it could be the men's shed, it could be a walking group, or any of those sort of kind of group-based activities, are the people who do that, the studies would show us, seem to have, it has a protective effect on their brain health.
What about technology then? What role does that play in helping to keep people connected. Is that the same as in person?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there isn't any clear studies that compare technology-based interaction versus in-person interaction, but there definitely have been studies which will look at people who've engaged in groups which are online, or it might be, an interest group, or it might be a particular support group or a community group, and all of that activity seems to have a protective effect.
And are there any specific activities which could be a risk when it comes to our brain health?
Yeah, I suppose from a lifestyle perspective, there is good evidence that smoking and excess alcohol consumption are risk factors for developing dementia and therefore harmful to brain health. From a sort of another perspective then, I guess there's some data about traumatic brain injury. So in middle life, traumatic brain injury, that's kind of a significant head injury, is associated with a risk of dementia as we age. And I guess there's been a lot of work looking at why that might be, and it's probably to do that the injury itself sets off inflammation and other sort of negative processes in the chemistry of the brain. So from that point of view, I guess, a lot of the data from that has come from road traffic accidents. So it's really important that people are aware of the importance of wearing a helmet when cycling or using a motorcycle, wearing a seatbelt in when they're behind the wheel of a car or a passenger, etc. There's been a lot, I suppose, over the last few years about milder traumatic brain injury and concussion in the sporting world. It's still, I suppose, a field that's being looked at, and the studies are, debated somewhat, but undoubtedly there have been very positive kind of interventions made in the various different sporting, the field sports, particularly around trying to reduce the risk of concussion and mild traumatic brain injury, particularly in younger players and amateur players. So I think there's a lot of awareness around that, and that can only be a positive thing.
You touched on dementia earlier. Can we talk about what's happening in the brain with dementia?
Yeah, so I suppose dementia is an umbrella term that describes or defines a situation where people have developed cognitive symptoms, so that's problems with their memory or their judgment, their attention span or their language skills, that has impacted on their ability to function independently. There are lots of different causes and reasons why that might happen, the most common being Alzheimer's disease. But there's other types of dementia and causes like vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia. There are several different potential causes. Dementia is where, I suppose, the cognitive difficulties have become established to the extent that day-to-day life has been impacted and people might need more support in organising their affairs or their personal day-to-day life.
And you mentioned loss of hearing can be one of the risk factors, but there are others.
Yeah, so in total, I suppose at least 12 have been very clearly defined by a very large study group organised by the Lancet Commission. So they include ones we've touched on, like alcohol, smoking, physical inactivity, social isolation, diabetes, obesity, and you mentioned hearing. And then going back into earlier life, educational exposure is a really important one as well. So that, I suppose, allows us to build a certain cognitive reserve, as it's called. So the more educational exposure we've had the opportunity to avail of up to the age of about 18 or 20, the more the reserve is in place for the effects of aging and other things that we might do in lifestyle as we pass into middle and later life. I guess a couple of the other ones in terms of risk factors, air pollution has been identified as one in recent years as well. And one which is still probably a little bit debated but seems to have a fairly significant impact is sleep and maintenance of sleep quality. So insufficient sleep, burning the candles at both ends, so to speak, seems to be a risk for developing cognitive impairment and dementia in later life.
And is a decline in brain health something we can reverse or slow down? Does remission come up in these sort of diagnoses?
So I guess it can do. It depends a little bit on the cause. So certainly people can develop mild cognitive impairment, which means that from a performance and cognitive tests that they're not where they were or where they should be for their age. But that doesn't inevitably mean a progression to dementia. In fact, very many people in that situation will not progress to dementia. And I suppose that's where a lot of the emphasis in the last few years has been around trying to defer, delay or prevent dementia development in those who already have cognitive symptoms or cognitive impairment. And that's where those kind of interventions that we spoke about in terms of brain health, so being physically active, keeping an eye on things like one's weight and one's diet, staying socially connected, minding one's sort of mental health and looking at things like blood pressure and diabetes, that they're modifying those, is almost certainly likely to defer any potential progression from mild cognitive impairment through to dementia.
So what are your key takeaways when it comes to brain health?
So I suppose to summarize, we would say probably three things. So love your heart, because the heart and the brain are really intricately connected. And a lot of the risk factors for heart disease and vascular disease are also risk factors for brain disease and harm to brain health. So that's keeping an eye on things like blood pressure, keeping an eye on your weight, trying to avoid, because weight is very closely linked to type 2 diabetes, so trying to avoid the development of diabetes in middle and later life, and not smoking. And alcohol as well is another kind of component of that. Bad for the heart, bad for blood pressure, bad for the brain. So love your heart, stay sharp, and that's about kind of staying connected cognitively. So staying engaged in, the things, the pastimes, the hobbies, the social engagements that people have always enjoyed, maintaining those is really important. And then lastly, keeping connected. And again, that speaks to sort of staying connected with the community, with the family, getting out, exercise. They're all sort of broadly connected in terms of themes of staying active. So physically active, socially active, cognitively active.
Sean, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.